I want to welcome you to this Questioning God series that we'll be doing tonight and the two following Wednesday evenings. So I appreciate you hearing about it and showing up, and we're really excited to have John Hopper here. This is going to be a fun conversation, and we'll see where everything goes. We've got the whole world to talk about, potentially, the universe, actually. So let me open us in prayer, and then we'll begin. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for the beauty of your work in our lives and just how precious we are to you and just how you pursue us with a never-ending love, Lord. I pray that tonight we would glorify you in our conversation and all that we discuss as we unpack John's recent book. And we do all this to your glory, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, John, you have been a friend of MDPC for a few years now, but tell us a little bit about yourself personally.
Sure.
And about Search, and kind of let people get to know you a little bit.
That's right. So I work for an organization called Search Ministries. So Search has been around for about 45 years, in about 20 different cities around the country. And what we really do is we create spaces where people hopefully feel very comfortable to ask their questions about God and Christianity and the Bible. So there's a lot of people that aren't ready for church yet, and they've got concerns, but they still like to talk about things. And so we try to create events or gatherings. Sometimes they're in country clubs, sometimes they're at home, sometimes they're in restaurants or at businesses where just people feel kind of comfortable on their turf talking about sort of the bigger questions of life. So that's what I do with Search, is I put together these kinds of gatherings. And as just personally, I've been married for about 34 years now, and my wife's from Houston. I grew up in California, but she got me here as soon as she could. And we have 4 children. The youngest is here with me. She's a senior now at A&M. The others are all out of school doing their thing. So that's a bit of me personally.
She's behind the book table.
Yeah, that's right.
Big help. Well, John, right before I came to faith, my junior year at UT, I started considering heavy questions, which I didn't do much of until that year leading up to when I became a Christian. And I found myself a little overwhelmed with some of the life's big questions about the Bible and faith and so forth. But I reached out to a musician buddy of mine, and I felt like...
Because the musicians have all the answers to life, right?
Something about the mathematics of the scale.
Okay, all right, great.
At any rate, he was very kind to spend 2 hours with me at the foot of the UT Tower, unpacking a lot of these questions that are in your new book.
Yeah.
And that played the biggest part in me coming to faith.
Wow.
So when I heard about your book and then read it, and it was an easy read, even though the questions are not easy, they're very complex and very important. I got really excited about that and just thought this would be a great opportunity for all of us to get a little better versed on these questions that tend to come up with some regularity.
That's right, yeah. So actually the chapters in the book are, each chapter is a question. And there's 15 questions there, and they're really the 15 most commonly asked questions that we get asked as a staff of Search around the country. So they are commonly asked. They do come up over and over again. And so Search had a book, but they felt like they needed to sort of update it a bit, so they had me write it last year. So
yeah, well, it's a very fun read, even though it's not light reading at the same time. So. Well, let's just go ahead and start.
Okay.
We've picked some questions to walk through tonight, and we'll have some others in the following weeks. So let's start with just this kind of cardinal one. Why should I believe that God exists? That's starting at the beginning, or maybe the non-beginning in God's case.
Yeah. That's a pretty big question. How should I know that God exists, right? So, and it's a fundamental question, right? Because if there is a God that is a creator God, and there is a God who cares about his creation, and there is a God that cares about sort of what we do in life, right, then that can fundamentally sort of change sort of the whole specter of life, right? So this question about whether God exists or not is a big one. And it's a question that really, I think more people have than we realize. Even people that are sitting at church, who you'd say they're all in with God, there's still this lingering doubt, but am I just making this up? Like, how can I really know that there's a God? So a couple years ago when Dan Akins was starting up Alpha here, he asked me for the sort of the first round of Alpha if I would be sort of one of the small group leaders, right? So within the first week or two, I asked the question to the people that were in the small group. I said, if you could ask any question about God or Christianity or the Bible, what question would you ask? And this one gal, she was probably in the late 20s, she said, well, my question is that I just want to know whether God really exists or not. Now, this is a gal who's actually been going to an MDVC Bible study for about a year, her deal. And her friend was kind of shocked when she asked the question. Like you're not sure about the God thing? Like, haven't you sort of been a part of this for a year? So it's a question that I think a lot more people have than sort of even voice it. So I think there's a lot of pieces of evidence that sort of point to the existence of God. I talk about 5 in the book, but I'll share a couple of them here tonight. So the first one has to do with what we might call sort of the fine-tuning of the universe. But let me explain it this way. Let's suppose that you went to a town that had just experienced a tornado going through it, okay? And so, I mean, homes are just disastrous, right? So you go into this one home, and you see paper strewn everywhere, and you see plates broken and pictures smashed on the ground. And if you go into that home, you probably wouldn't think, oh, somebody placed that picture there, or they broke the dishes, or the papers that were purposely put that way. Yeah. It just looks random, right? But if you went into another house that you had some damage to it, but you went into it and the pictures are sort of still neatly placed on the mantle, and the dishes are still stashed nicely, and the books are all on the bookshelf, you probably wouldn't think that they randomly got that way, right? Because they're too finely placed there. So you would assume, no, this is the way they were put, right? There was some intelligent mind behind their positioning, right? And I think when we look at the universe and when we understand the universe better, it looks like a place that's a home that's been finely put together. It's not just sort of randomly sort of strewn about.
And there's evidence of
that. There's
that.
evidence of that. So one of the pieces of evidence has to do with the physical constants that govern our universe. So the one that we're most familiar with is gravity, right? So it governs an awful lot in our world, right? But it's not the only physical constant. There are other physical constants as well, like the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force or the mass density or the expansion rate of the universe, all those kinds of things, right? And all of those things have to be just as they are for life to exist, not just on Earth, but anywhere in the universe.
There's really no room for error.
There's no room for error. They all have to be finely tuned as they are. So let's just take gravity, for example. So gravity, if it was a little bit stronger, all the sort of the planets would basically sort of implode on one another. It would be too strong. If it wasn't as strong as it is, then they would sort of fly apart. They never would have coalesced in the first place, right? So it has to be just as it is. And as cosmologists have sort of looked at it, they're like, oh my goodness, like if it just was slightly, just a teeny bit different, then it would be messed up, chaotic. So I've got a couple of slides here that sort of talk about sort of this fine tuning. So maybe we can sort of throw up the first slide. It has to do with the gravitational constant. And cosmologists tell us that if it varied by more than 1 in 10 to the 60th, parts, planets and stars couldn't have formed and no life could have existed. So let me explain to you kind of how big or kind of crazy this number is, okay? So let's suppose my wife is super sensitive to the temperature in the house, okay? So if it's 73, it's too cold, and if it's 74, it's too hot. So I rig the system so it's got tenths of a degree, right, to find the exact temperature. And I get to 73.4 and it's still too cold, 73.5 and it's too hot, right?
Have you been in my house?
So I got to fine tune it even more, right? So there's just 10 bars between each degree at first, but then I make it 1,000 bars, and then I make it 100,000 bars. I still can't find the right temperature, so I make it a trillion bars between each degree, and finally I find the exact temperature that my wife is satisfied at. Yeah. That's the fine-tuning that's necessary for gravity, for life to exist anywhere in the universe. And it's not just gravity. Again, it's all these physical constants that have to be lined up. So the slides after the one that was just shown there show some of the odds of some of the other physical constants. So the cosmological constant, which impacts the expansion rate of the universe, cosmologists say that if it was different by 1 part in 10 to the 120th, okay, that makes 1 in 10 to the 60th look tiny.
Yeah,
So if it just was a little bit off, then again, no life in the universe. And then the next slide, which constant does it bring up? The mass density, okay? If it was just slightly different as well, then there would be no life anywhere in the universe. So you have these dozens of these constants out there, okay? And if any of them is just slightly different, then there's no life in the universe.
I mean, you're talking about extraordinary. Super fine-tuning.
Super fine-tuning, right? So if you go even behind the sound booth right there, there's a soundboard there. And if you go into the sanctuary, I'm sure it's even a much bigger soundboard. So it's got all these knobs and sliders and buttons. Now imagine that here at MDPC, they're putting in a new soundboard, okay? And maybe they're putting it in right before it's sort of the Christmas special service, right? So you want it to be just right. So they're installing the new soundboard. And when the sound engineers put it in, they recognize, they're like, oh my goodness, like every knob and every slider and every button is exactly as it needs to be so that everything sounds perfect.
Right.
Now, my guess is the sound engineers wouldn't say, man, we just got lucky. They'd say somebody knew this venue, somebody knew the sound requirements here, somebody knew the system, that's why it was all set up this way. And so I think it's, when we look at this fine-tuning of the universe, it should point us to this designer there, this personality behind it all that was tweaking the dials and pushing the buttons and moving the sliders to be just as they need to be.
Yeah, that evidence is hard to sneeze at. In anticipation of our conversation, I looked up the definition, or a definition of evidence, and I got the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid.
Yeah.
So you've talked about one first kind of evidence.
That's right.
What's another kind?
Now this piece of evidence is completely different than that kind of piece of evidence. So, and it has to do with our moral intuitions. Okay. So there's certainly in this day and age people who say, well, there's no real right and wrong. It's right and wrong is all relative, and it's just what this society thinks or what this person thinks. But when you start to drill down with people, no one actually really believes that. Every person has things that they believe are right or wrong for everyone. Right. And it doesn't usually take a whole lot of digging to sort of figure out what those things are. So let's say that you have a friend and your friend really loves dogs, okay? And you show up one day and she asks, well, what'd you do this weekend? Oh, my buddies and I, we got together, we went down to the shelter, we adopted these dogs, but really the reason we adopted them is because we wanted to take them to the lake. We were just doing this experiment. We were going to dunk them under the water and see how long it took to drown them each.
Nice.
Now, very quickly, that person, if she said, well, all right and wrong, it's all relative sort of deal, you would find out very quickly that she believed that there was an objective moral truth involved with dogs, right?
Absolutely.
And that you shouldn't just for fun or for interest or curiosity drown them, right? So, and everyone has those things that they believe are right and wrong, not just for themselves, but for everyone. So that's when you're driving down the road sort of deal, and you get mad at somebody sort of thing, you don't say to yourself, well, it's okay. If it's okay for them to cut off people, it's okay for them. I'm good with that. No, you say that's wrong. They shouldn't have done that. Everybody believes in sort of objective moral truths. But here's the thing. If there truly are objective moral truths, which our intuitions point to all the time, there has to be a God who's sort of setting those moral truths. Because if you and I are just accidents of the cosmos, if we're just what's spilled out of the box, then there is no right or wrong. So if there's a box here with all the Scrabble pieces in it, and the cat jumps up here and knocks it all down on the floor. When the pieces all went down on the floor, you probably wouldn't say, that is so wrong that X is next to the L. No, it's just the way the things fell out of the box. Well, if you and I are just randomly here, we're just what spilled out of the box, ultimately out of the cosmos, then there is no right or wrong to what we do. We're just an X and an L, and that's it. There's no right or wrong to anything. And I'm not really making that up. So I've got a couple of quotes here from some atheists who say, from an atheist position, there is no right or wrong. So maybe we can pull up the quote from Richard Dawkins here. So Richard Dawkins says, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. So he's an atheist, right? And he says, there is no evil at all. So the only way that we can say that things are wrong is if there's actually a God behind it. Okay?
So would that be one of those examples of things that we say that are very grand and subjective and so forth, but when it comes to how we actually live our lives,
that's right.
There's a collective objectivity
there is
that we all share.
That's right. We all really sort of, even Richard Dawkins, right? Okay, says there's no evil, there's no good or bad sort of deal. But he says teaching your children religion is child abuse. Okay? Well, when he says that, he's implicitly saying that what you are doing is wrong. He doesn't say, well, if you teach your children religion, that's okay, because that's okay for you, but it's not okay for me. He doesn't say that. He's saying it's child abuse and what you're doing is wrong, right? So he can't even get away from objective morals.
Because he's declaring that something's wrong.
He's declaring that something's wrong. Yeah. So, but again, if there is objective morals, which I believe that all of our intuitions are sort of driving towards, then there is a lawgiver as well. Now, here's what's interesting, I think, and why this piece of evidence about God is really important, is if you take a look at our sort of moral intuitions, okay, what we think is right and wrong, and we may disagree on some of that, right? But they all go in the direction of love and justice. We say, that's so uncaring for that person to do that. They shouldn't act that way. That's about love, right? That's so unfair. That's wrong. You shouldn't steal that, right? All of our polls towards sort of what's right and wrong, they're all in the direction of love and justice. Well, in Scripture, what do we see are the two main characteristics of God? That he's loving and that he's just.
He's both.
He's both of those things. So those moral intuitions that we have that require there to be a God also point to the character of God. So he's not just a fine-tuning designer who makes things, but he's also a God that has character, that is both loving and just, and that's why we have those sort of moral intuitions.
Thank God.
Yeah.
Well, if there's this evidence for the universe that you've already unpacked, which is pretty compelling, if not convincing, why, so you've declared that these things are true. Why is atheism still kind of a viable consideration in some people's minds? Like, why do they keep persisting, denying that objectivity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some cases, they're just not aware of the evidence, right? So oftentimes when I have an opportunity to share the evidence with people, they're kind of a bit stunned. They just didn't even know it existed. They just figured it was just really, you just had to take it by complete blind faith.
We just don't think about these things.
We just don't think about these things. So some of it just has to do that. So there's been a number of cases already with the book Questioning God, when people have read through the first 2 chapters that really sort of center on God and his existence, that they've changed their position. So the staff person with Search in Austin, he had a fellow said, I'm atheist, agnostic. Well, I don't really think there's a God. Well, would you be willing to read one of the chapters in this book? Maybe we can talk about it, sort of present some evidence for the existence of God. And they went through the first few chapters, and his response was, I would be a fool not to believe in God.
Wow.
So some of it's just not having been exposed to the evidence, right? So, but beyond that, there's also, in many cases, a desire for there not to be a God. Right?
We don't want to. We can't handle the truth.
That's right. We just don't want it to be there. And some people are honest about that, really. They'll say, I don't want there to be a God. So one example of that would be Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is a philosopher out of NYU. He would be considered maybe one of the top 10 philosophers in America today, right? So very respected philosopher. And he wrote a book a couple of years ago that his atheist comrades didn't really like so much, but the title of it was something along the lines of, maybe this was the subtitle, Why Neo-Darwinian Evolution is Almost Certainly False.
Wow.
Okay? And he's an atheist, he's
Right.
saying this, and his whole argument was, how can you explain consciousness? Okay? So consciousness and the thoughts that we have are immaterial things. We are material beings. How do you go from material to immaterial, right? He goes, it just doesn't make sense to me, okay? He goes, there has to be some other explanation than neo-Darwinianism, okay? And then he says, now my religious friends have an answer to this question, and I really respect them in a lot of ways, but I just don't want there to be a God.
Wow.
I don't want it to be true. And so he's keeping it at bay, even though from his own sort of philosophical, reasoning, there's reason to believe that there is a God.
So he's put a mental
That's
block
right. That's
in
right.
that place, like I am not going to go
That's
there.
right. And we know people, and we've probably been there ourselves at times, where we just didn't want to believe something that was true. And people show us the evidence, no, it's not true, sort of. And maybe eventually there's just so much evidence we finally, I didn't have it right. But we can be resistant for all kinds of personal reasons.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Okay, well, let's shift to another question. It's kind of tied to what we've been talking about. Can we know the truth about anything? Because there's a lot of conversation about this in this relative age that we're in.
Yeah. So in some ways, this can be I call it an escape hatch question. So if someone asks you a question like, well, how do we know God really exists, and you give them some evidence, but they don't want to really hear the evidence, they might say something like, well, how can we really know the truth about anything? So it's like they went from one, they weren't comfortable with the evidence you gave them, so they just retreated to this place, well, we really can't know anything about anything, right? So, but on another level, I think this question is important today because I think there's an increasing number of people who say, can we really know the truth about anything? Like, there's so much fake news out there. Like, can we really know what's going on in Ukraine? Can we know what's going on in the Oval Office? What about the CDC and the COVID? Like, how, we're getting these competing voices, so how can I really just sort of discover what's true? And
hard
so,
to know.
yeah, it can be hard to know. So I think that indeed there are places where it can be hard for us to know what is true about something. But I think that if we go to the place where we say it's impossible to know what's true about anything, we've actually gone too far, okay? So let's say even for tonight, when you left your home, you probably didn't say, well, I'm just going to pull out of the driveway and drive anywhere because I don't really know where MDPC is. Like, it could be there, it could not be there. I don't know the truth about where it's at. It could, I can't know the truth about that, so we'll just drive and we'll see if we bump into it. Like, nobody probably did that, right? Like, you knew where it was, and so you set out that way. So in that sense, right, you knew that to be true, right? So you didn't have an argument with yourself about it. So,
hopefully.
Or even sort of maybe more dramatically is, let's say that you live really close to the church, and you said, I'm just going to walk there. Half a mile away, I'll just walk on down to the church. And so you begin walking, and there's cars that are coming down, maybe down Blaylock here, so they're driving down, and you probably didn't say to yourself, well, I don't really know that if I step in front of a car that it will hurt me. So, I'll just, I want to cross the street right here, so I'll just sort of walk in front of it, but nobody thought that, right? Like, we know that if you walk in front of a car and you're squarely hit by it and it's going 30 or 40 miles an hour, it's not going to go well for you, right? So it may be true that we have a hard time knowing the truth about some things, but to retreat to the idea that we can't know anything about anything, I think, goes too far that way. So I think we have to be sort of careful with that. Now, of course, you might say, well, how do we discover what's true, right? And I think ultimately what we're looking at is that preponderance of evidence that we've talked about. We're not looking at just mere possibilities. Some people say, well, if there's a possibility that something else could have caused something, then we can never really be sure about something, okay? But I'm not so sure that's the case. So let's say that someone steals your car, okay? You don't know who steals the car, but it's found. In fact, it's found in my garage. And it's been dismantled. And pieces of it are in boxes that are labeled to be sent places, like I'm selling the parts of your car. So somebody, gets a lead on it, so they call the police, and they come over to my house, and they discover there's your car in my garage, partly dismantled. It's going to be sent all over the place, right? And the police, they're about to arrest me, and I say, well, wait a second here, I know that it looks like I did it, but it really, can't you see? It's possible really that aliens just came down and they took the car and they put it in the garage and they dismantled it and they labeled it. It just looks like I did, but I didn't really do it. It's the aliens who did it. And what if the police said, well, you know what, that is a possibility. Maybe there are aliens out there. Maybe they did come here, sort of deal, and so they didn't arrest me. If it was your car, I think you'd be rather upset. You'd say, we know that he took the car and he's selling the car, right? So just because there's a mere possibility of something, it shouldn't keep us from being confident of what's true. And I think a lot of people do that. They'll say, well, maybe it could have possibly be this, sort of thing. So how can we really know what's true? And I think we can know what's true by looking again at sort of that great preponderance of evidence, not just mere possibilities.
Right. So if people say things like, I can't know anything, or none of us can know anything, even just saying that with a definitive attitude, that's a little bit self-defeating.
It is self-defeating, right? Because they're saying you can know something.
And they know that.
That's right. You can know that you don't know anything, right? So it sort of backs them into a corner. Now, here's a point to this, Brett, that I think is really important, is that I think some people, the reason they sort of get confused on this is because they know that we don't know everything about something, and so they're not sure if we can be confident about some things. And I don't think that's true. So let's take the sun, for example. There are a lot of things we don't know about the sun. So there's been a probe up there for the last 4 years sort of trying to discover different things about the sun. Like, did you know that the sun's atmosphere is hotter than the sun's surface? Unless the probe sort of just recently figured that out, nobody knows why is the atmosphere actually hotter than the surface of the sun is. And what's at the middle of the sun? I don't know. Is it a Tootsie Roll there? Sort of like, I don't know what's at the middle of the sun, right? So there's a lot of things we don't know about the sun. But there's some things we know about the sun. We know that if we stare at it long enough, it will hurt our eyes, right? We know that certain plants need it in order to grow, right? So we know it's healthy for us to get out in the sun some. So we know that when the sun will come up, we will know that when it will go down. In fact, we organize our lives by the sun. So we don't know everything about the sun, but there are some things we know with great confidence, and again, we shape our lives by it. So when it comes to the question of God, people say, well, we can't really know everything about God, so can we really know anything? Yes, we can know some things, right? We may not know everything about God. In fact, we don't know everything about God, and in eternity, I don't believe we'll be able to sort of plumb the depths of God, right? So, but that doesn't mean that we can't know some things, and we can even bank our life on it and organize our life around what we know to be true about God.
And just as an aside, we don't want to worship a God that we know everything about. We want to be a little bit transcendent in that sense. So, okay, so if truth is knowable, then how do we know the truth? How do we arrive at the truth?
Yeah, well, I think, again, sort of going back to sort of that preponderance of evidence, right? So if you've never been to the church here before, but you looked it up on the internet and you asked your friends and they said it was located there, and maybe you saw an aerial view, okay, there's where MDPC is, right? So, and you had all those pieces of evidence, like you would be really confident. In fact, most of you probably, if you've never been here before, you didn't do all of that. You just pushed it into your phone, right? And it just sort of took you here. And you've had enough sort of instances with your phone to believe that, okay, it's going to tell me where it is. It's going to point me to the right place. So I think that that's, in many cases, how we, sort of come to know things. Now, we also come to know things by experience, right? So, and in fact, I would say that experience, in many ways, is sort of the greater teacher of us, right? So I have a lot of tennis in my background. I was a tennis pro in the past. My wife's a pro at the Houston Racquet Club, and so we've taught a lot of people tennis over the years. And I can tell someone to do something like, turn your hips this way, or let's move the grip this way, or something like that. And they might look at me a little quizzically, or like, really, this
doesn't feel right.
Doesn't feel right, or whatever. Yeah. But if they start to do it, and it starts to have the results, they're like, oh. See, that's a different kind of knowledge, right? It's a knowledge that comes by experience. So in some ways, I would say that the knowledge about God is not just knowledge that we learn, say, from the Bible. It's a knowledge that we learn when we actually put into play the things that God said. In fact, Jesus at one point in John chapter 7, he says, you will know whether my teaching comes from God when you obey what I'm commanding you. So it wasn't like you'll know and then you'll do. It says you'll do and then you'll know. It's not until you step into it that you actually come to sort of see the value of it, right? So, and we've all done that in life, where we thought something was stupid and then we did it, and it's like, oh, that really is a good way to do it, right? So sometimes the way that we can come to confidence in God is actually beginning to sort of walk in the advice that he gives us.
It's that experiential aspect of being in relationship with God and trying it on for size even. So let's go back to reason a little bit. What does reason have to do with God? Why is it so important that any of us, all of us, need to be people of reason?
Well, I think that God gave us a mind, right? So, and he gave us a mind so that we might know him, right? So, and enjoy him. So if we didn't have that mind, right? So, which is reason, so then we couldn't understand him. If we were a single cell without a mind, right? So could we really know God? I don't think we could know God. So God has given us reason in order to be able to understand who he is.
So you're saying amoebas don't really have that capacity?
Yeah, I don't think they have that capacity.
Just checking. Okay. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is for something that's this critical to life. I mean, these are life specific questions. To not examine all the possibilities that are out there is a pretty high risk way to live.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's possible for us to examine all the possibilities, right? But I think there ought to be a point where we've seen enough evidence that we're convinced of something, right? So again, you could always have the alien alibi, right? So there's that possibility. Well, there could be this or that, right?
A bazillion.
Yeah, but I think that when we do that we're really sort of skating on thin ice there. So I'll give you one example in regards to the fine-tuning piece of evidence that I gave you earlier. So today, sort of in the non-God-believing world, when they look at the fine-tuning evidence, the way that they deal with that is they say, well, yeah, this would be too crazy. The odds are too phenomenal for this to have just happened by chance. All these things to be fine-tuned.
Extraordinary mathematical possibility.
It's just impossible.
Yeah.
So, this is what they've done, is they've said, there must be zillions and zillions of universes out there, and we just happen to be the lucky one.
That's the multiverse.
That's the multiverse idea, okay? Yeah. So, now, I just want you to think through that. First of all, we have no evidence at all of any other universes, okay? And it's not even clear how we could ever come to knowledge of any other universes. But think of it this way. Let's suppose that you're lost in the forest somewhere. You've gone up for a hike. It's sort of a multi-day thing. You get lost in the forest. You're getting tired. You're getting hungry. You're not sure what to do. And then you see this little light in the distance. And you start going to where the light is, and it's a little cabin. You knock on the door, nobody's there. You're tired, you're hungry, you check the doorknob, it's open, you go in, right? And as you go in, immediately as you go in, it just feels so familiar. It smells like it has the smells that you like. You go to the refrigerator because you're really hungry. It's like it's stocked with exactly the foods and the brands that you like, right? So you're really tired, so you go over towards the bed, and the bed's like the perfect firmness. The pillow's just as you like it, right? So you go over to the mantle, and there's pictures of your family there.
Wow.
Now, you could say to yourself that, oh, somebody prepared all this for me. Or you could say, man, I must have just gotten lucky.
An extraordinary set of circumstances.
Yeah, there must be a zillion cabins out there, and I just happened to find the one that's all set up for me.
Right.
So, I mean, that would be a really silly, I think, idea. Like if anybody said that, right? Say, oh, there must just be a zillion cabins, and I just found the lucky one, right? And yet that's what people are really doing with the multiverse, is they're coming up with really kind of what I would say preposterous sort of ideas
Right.
to get away from where the evidence just keeps pounding.
That's such a personal sounding story too. So how can a person, let's just get down to brass tacks,
Okay.
how can a person believe in God in this scientific age that
Okay.
we're in,
Yeah.
men going to the moon and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, because I do think people see a divide between science and religion, right? Like science is where you use your mind, and and religion isn't where you use your mind.
And never
right?
shall the two meet.
Never shall the two meet. That's right. So, now I think just by showing you some of the evidence that I did earlier, you can see where there's a way in which science can point to the existence of God. But I think in some cases that people feel like there's this divide because they believe that the scientific community itself, which they revere, okay? And there's some reasons to revere the scientific community, right? Every single day, we use and experience things that came from science, right? The cars we drive, even the cups that we drink, right? I mean, the styrofoam was a scientific invention at
I'm
one point.
grateful for the
Right,
community
right?
of science.
Our phones,
for sure.
right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that we're just really thankful for, what science has given us. And so sometimes there's this idea that the scientists who have given us so many good things believe that you just can't put the two together. And so I want to be with them, and I don't want to be over here. But interestingly, that's not the case. So Elaine Howard Eklund, who's at Rice University, she's a sociologist there, her main interest of study has been what scientists believe about religion. And so she's done surveys and personal interviews of hundreds and hundreds of scientists at elite universities in the United States and across the world.
All over the world.
All over the world. So she's not dealing with community college professors. She's the cream of the crop, okay? And she's asking what they believe about science and religion. Now, if you do surveys of scientists, you'll find that they're far more likely to not believe in God than the general population. But when they're asked the question, do you see there's a fundamental conflict between science and religion? Only 15% say yes.
It's amazing.
Only 15% of elite scientists believe there's a fundamental conflict between the two. So why do we, in the name of defending science, say that there's a fundamental conflict? I don't think that we should if we look at what scientists have to say. And interestingly, those scientists who don't believe in God, okay, if they're asked why they don't believe in God, they almost never say that it was their science that led them there. They say, oh, well, I never grew up that way, or I'm just too into, my scientific pursuits, I never really give it any thought. But they rarely ever say it was my science that led me to that.
So they're
conclusion.
denying even their scientific approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like just from that sort of piece of evidence that we should just sort of create this divide, right? So we might still say there's reasons in the scientific age to not believe in God, but we shouldn't do it because we think that the scientific community believes that, because they simply don't. Now, I think one of the reasons why people sort of get confused on this issue is because they think that if we've discovered the scientific cause to something, okay, that displaces the existence of God or the need for God, okay? So people sometimes will say, well, your God is just the God of the gaps. Okay, so you don't understand how something works, so you say, well, God did it. But now, see, we figured out how it works scientifically, so we don't need your God anymore. All right? So, but scientists who are Christians have always said that, oh, when we discover how things are made, we don't feel like that displaces God. It just lets us know how God made something, right? Mm-hmm. So my wife and I, we renovated our kitchen 2 years ago, okay? So new countertops, new sink, some new appliances, put a new floor, we repainted the cabinets, and that sort of thing. So we renovated our kitchen. But actually, in many ways, we didn't. We didn't lift a finger to do it, hardly, right? The contractors, the subcontractors did it. They put in the floor, they put in the appliances, they put in the countertop, right? They did all of that, right? Okay? But is it right for us to say that we renovated it? I think it is, because we provided the money, we provided we picked out the appliances, right? So, and the colors, we hired the contractors and that sort of thing. So if you discover that, oh, it wasn't really you who did it, it was these other people who did it, it doesn't displace us. It just shows that there is a secondary cause. We were the primary cause to the kitchen being renovated, and they were the secondary cause. So when science discovers things, it doesn't displace God, it just shows us the secondary cause that he has sort of used. So God doesn't need plants to grow, sort of make a plant grow, if he's already put the sun in place and the soil in place, and he's put the seed in place for it all to happen, right? So he doesn't need to sort of put sort of this extra sort of magical God sort of power into it to grow, because he's put those other things into place, and we've discovered them. So if you say, oh, it's not God who makes it grow, it's photosynthesis who makes it grow. Yeah, but somebody put the sun there, right, sort of deal. And even if you say, well, the sun came about because of these other cosmic factors, well, where did those other cosmic factors come?
Exactly.
I think behind it all, we still have the need for God.
So why do you think people have fallen into this dichotomy of, it's pitting one against the other, science against faith? What are the factors that...
Well, again, in some cases, it's just that people sort of, they don't want there to be a God, right? So they sort of create that divide. So, in fact, I would say, historically speaking, that the divide between science and religion or Christianity actually was caused in that way. So, it came about because of that. Because the early scientists, many of them were Christians. So there are those who didn't want the influence of religion in higher education, and so they tried to create this divide. But I think now, in many cases, the reason why people see this divide is because they have bought in, because it's told us so often, to this assumption of materialism or naturalism, we might say, where all there is nature.
This is it.
This is it.
Yeah.
And as a result, because we're beginning with that assumption, we're only going to allow there to be natural explanations for things. We're not going to allow the possibility of a supernatural explanation, because we're starting the game with the rules that there's no supernatural. So it would be a bit like if there's a car parked out in front of my house, and I were to say, well, how did that car get there? And you were to say, well, we can't, whatever we do, whatever explanation for that car is, we can't come up with an explanation that includes a manufacturer at all. Okay, I guess if that's the rules of the game, then we'll try to figure out how that car got there without a manufacturer, right? So the wind came, and this kind of dynamic happened, and these physics took place, and the sun did this or whatever sort of deal, and then it would be a pretty crazy plan sort of deal, but that's all we could come up with, because if we're setting the rules at the beginning that all there is nature, we're not allowing that possibility to begin with. And so some people have taken science, and science is really used to measure how nature interacts with nature, right? It's not talking at all about how supernatural sort of interplays with that at all. And people are saying, well, see, there's no God involved, but science was never sort of meant to detect really whether there was a God.
That wasn't the purpose.
That wasn't the purpose. It's just for us to understand how nature interacts with nature. So it would be like if you took a metal detector to the beach, and you went all around, and then you came back and you said, there's no oil here. wait a second here, like it's a metal detector. It's not an oil detector, right? So it's meant to show us whether there's metal there. So if we use science and we say, well, we've got natural explanations for things, so there is no God, right? Well, of course your science isn't going to necessarily show you that, because science isn't meant to sort of show us the supernatural. So it's meant to show us how nature interacts with nature. But people have bought into this belief today that all there is nature, so we can only have natural explanations to things.
So you have that natural side of things. Is there another factor what about scientism?
So there's scientism, right? There's some people that believe that science is the only source of knowledge, right? So some people, it's because they sort of they think of science really as sort of the end all, right? So the only real truth that we can have about anything is if we get it from the sciences, and particularly the hard sciences, right? Those are the only things that we can really be sure about, and that's really the most important information. And yet, I just don't think that's true.
Well, doesn't that deny even the scientific method itself?
So the scientific method, can you run an experiment to prove the scientific method? You can't.
Right.
You can't do that. So in some sense, the scientific method is not even scientific, right? So you just have to sort of begin with that apparatus there. But there's a lot of times where we would have to say that science isn't sort of giving us always the most sure information or even the best information, okay, the most valuable information. For example, let's say that science came to us today and said, this is the cure to cancer. Like this really is, you've got cancer, this is it. This is the treatment that you want.
This time for sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right, this is it. So if someone came to me, I had cancer, and they said, this is a cure to cancer. And then someone said to me, William Shakespeare really lived. Which one do I actually believe more? I would believe more that William Shakespeare really lived. Now, it could be that the cancer cure works sort of deal, but there's an awful lot of evidence out there that William Shakespeare lived, okay? And there's times when scientific sort of answers to questions haven't really worked out all that well, right? So if you were to ask me which one am I most sure of, I'd actually be more sure that William Shakespeare lived, and yet there's no scientific evidence for it. There's historical evidence for it, right? So, but historical evidence is very valuable still. Like science isn't the only source of information, and we can get information from other sources as well. So, or think of it this way: if you go to your father's dying, you go in the hospital, and his sort of dying breath tells you some very sweet things. Tells you he loves you, tells you how valuable you are, sort of thing. Nobody else hears that conversation. And there's no recording at all, okay? Now, when you get away from that situation, your father has died, sort of deal, and you say, well, what's the most important knowledge that I have? Well, I know, say, some scientific truth about how water boils, and I know what my father told me. Which is more important? It's what your father told you, right? This is kind of interesting, but this is important, right? So this idea that the sort of the most important information only comes from the sciences, or the only information that we can really rely upon is the sciences, I just think it's patently false.
Right.
So we've sort of elevated science to sort of too high a point.
Yeah.
And so we just have to be careful of that.
Yeah, I hear you valuing science.
Absolutely.
Like I do.
Absolutely.
But it only has the limits
it has its limits
of what science
That's right.
is all about in the first place.
Yeah.
So let's shift completely out of some of the things we've been talking about and just want to start talking about some of the pushback that people have about Christians, let's say.
Okay.
So what about the question about, and this comes up from time to time, people will say, well, haven't Christians caused more harm in the world than good?
Yeah.
How would you even begin to respond to that?
Well, I think the first thing is that we should certainly admit that Christians have caused a lot of harm, right? So, and we can maybe talk about big picture things, like maybe the Crusades or something like that. But we can talk about it on a very individual basis, right? Like we know people who are Christians that have hurt people. And guess what? If you identify as a Christian tonight, you too have hurt people, right? you have said things, you have done things that have been hurtful to people, right? So I don't think we need to deny the fact that Christians have sort of hurt people at times, right? But we do have to be sort of careful in sort of canceling out Christianity because there have been Christians who have done some hurtful things.
Including us.
So, including us, right? Because ultimately, the reason we have to be careful with that is that I don't care what your standard is, whether it's religious or non-religious, religious or secular, Christian or non-Christian. I don't know if anybody lives up to their own standards, to their own philosophy of life. No one does. So if we cancel Christians because we see some Christian doing something that's harmful, okay, then we sort of have to cancel our own philosophy as well, right? Whatever it is,
yeah.
right? So that would put us in a pretty strange place there. So we have to be, sort of consistent there, and sort of have to be careful with that. And the interesting thing is this, is that I think sometimes people, and you've probably heard this yourself, and maybe you've been in this place before, is you say, well, those people at church, they're some hypocrites. Like, I don't want to be a part of that, right? And it's sort of an excuse not to be a part of the things of God or information about Jesus or following Jesus, right? But when you say that you hate hypocrisy, you say hate these hurtful things done sort of in the name of Christianity, you're actually aligning yourself with Jesus.
Who hated hypocrisy as well.
Because he hated hypocrisy,
Right.
right? So Jesus' harshest words were almost always really reserved for the people who were hypocrites. So if you're using hypocrisy to say away from Jesus, you're actually aligning yourself with him there. So you're with him. So he doesn't like it either at all. So you're kind of on Team Jesus when you come to that place, whether you knew it or not. There.
Sign me up to be on Team Jesus for sure. We've talked about how Christians on a personal level might create more harm than good, but what about Christians as a whole? More in the macro sense. Certainly there have been some things done in the name of Christianity that you mentioned the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, some other things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things when we look at those events is we have to be careful that we don't overplay those, okay? Now, there were some things that were done as regards to the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition, or in some cases sort of missionary oppression or whatever the case might be, that
genuinely
is not good. That is not
deplorable.
good. It's deplorable, right? That isn't good. But in many cases, it's been way overblown, okay? So, for example, in the Spanish Inquisition, we have pretty good records. Like, they found, the records of the sort of the courts of the Spanish Inquisition. And in those records, it shows 2,300 deaths as a result of the Spanish Inquisition, executions, over a period of over 200 years. That's 10 a year. If you go and look at the secular courts of that time, the secular courts were way more willing to see executions happen. And those who were involved in the Spanish Inquisition, they actually had all these rules about how to treat their prisoners properly, humanely, which didn't exist in the secular courts. So it doesn't mean that, hey, maybe there's still 2,300 more deaths than ought to have occurred, right? But sometimes the reports get way bigger than that.
You're not justifying those wrong deaths, but relatively speaking.
Exactly, relatively speaking. So I'm just sort of trying to pare those down to size, because if you say, I'm not going to follow Christianity because of things like the Spanish Inquisition, where are you going to turn? Are you going to turn to an atheist perspective?
Yeah, what's your better pool?
Okay, what's your better pool? Because in the 20th century, the atheist nations, China and Russia, right, the USSR, right, Cambodia, those kind of, they killed 100 million people. So if you're going to retreat from Christianity because, the harm it's caused, well, what are you going to retreat to, right? You say, well, I'm going to go to sort of the peaceful Buddhist perspective. Oh, really?
Yeah.
In Myanmar today, it's the Buddhist majority that is creating incredible havoc on people's lives, right? So it's like, so you just, it's like more harm than good. Like, how do you measure this? Where are you going to hide, sort of thing. Right. So now ultimately, right, it's not it's this numbers game, like, well, they created more harm than them, or we didn't create as much, or whatever. Ultimately, what it ought to be about is about whether the ideas and whether Jesus himself is worthy of being followed, regardless of whether the people who use his name or not are following what Jesus had to say, all right? So we really need to look at that. If you kind of created a company and you really worked hard to create a good reputation for your company, and so that when people heard the name of your company, that, oh man, that company is just a really great service. And then somebody else sort of takes your name and tries to get some business over here, but they don't provide the service. And suddenly you start getting like this feedback, like, oh, that company, they say they're all about good service, but they're really not, because I used company ABC and it didn't have good service. And you're like, wait a second here, we always provide good service here. And you know, who are these people? Like, and they really weren't even our customers. Like, what's going on here? Oh, there's people over here that are using the name, but they're not providing the service. And so what you're going to do then with people is you're going to say, hey, wait a second, that's not the original, okay? People are just using the name, but it's not really the original, so come back here to the original. And I think really in many cases that's what we ought to be doing sort of when we look at Christianity. There might be Christians who do things in the name of Christianity that aren't good, and they're sort of stealing the name of Jesus when they're doing the things that they're doing, and we need to get back to the original. See, the problem isn't with the Christian claims. The problem is that people aren't living out the Christian claims.
Right.
So we shouldn't say I'm going to dismiss the claims, right?
Right.
We should hold on to those
Throw
claims.
the baby out with the bathwater.
We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looking at my time, and we're at the...
All right.
So here's what I think we'll do.
Okay.
We're going to close for tonight, but I would like for you guys to come back next week. I hope you find John's delivery compelling like I do, and the book really gets into even greater detail, and I think it's a masterful work in its coherence and its simplicity in the midst of very, very difficult, some of the biggest challenging questions of all time. So I appreciate that you put so much sweat equity into the writing of that book. I think it's going to continue to just bear so much fruit. But be thinking of the questions that you would like to...
Yeah, and I'll hang out for a while here too if you have a question at all. So I don't necessarily expect you to like, oh, well, he said it, so it must be true, right? So if you say, man, yeah, he said that, but I'm not so sure about that, feel free to come to me. Like, I love those conversations. So
Yeah. And we'll have new questions next week and the following week, and feel free to invite your friends to come be part of that. Would you mind closing us, John?
Sure, absolutely.
Appreciate that.
So, Lord, I thank you that you invite our questions, that you want us to know you better. And so, Lord, I pray that you would lead us to good answers, Lord. And, Lord, I know for myself that as you have led me to good answers, ultimately that's meant that you've led me to you and the goodness of who you are, Lord. So, Lord, I pray that for those here tonight as well, Lord, that you would lead them to good answers and ultimately lead them to you as well. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give John a hand.